Reddit, what's the most legendary work meltdown you've seen? My PE teacher in the ninth grade got fired for this shit. She tells us to walk laps around the school for cardio day. Some kids decided to run and managed to finish 3 laps by the time the rest of us finished like 2. When we finish our second lap, we see the runners sitting, and the teacher just scream, "Get your goddamn puny asses over here!" She proceeds to push the whole class onto the track in 97-degree weather, and makes us sprint a mile and says that anybody who gets below 7:30 has to run it again. It was a 90-minute period. Everybody finishes, and she sits us down and calls us a multitude of bad words, and tells us that we should have finished 3 laps like they did instead of only 2, even though she told us to walk, not run, and they were running. The whole time we noticed that a girl isn't here anymore. We later found out she had to be taken away in an ambulance because she had asthma, and our bitch of a teacher denied her of her inhaler, so she fainted and was taken to the nurse's office immediately. I worked at Taco Bell while in high school. One of my co-workers was this guy who was really friendly, but also really strange. He was obsessed with being a straight-edge kid and drew the X's on his hands, and the whole 9 yards. He had a high-pitched but pleasant voice and spoke in an overly polite manner. Anyway, he had put in his 2 weeks, and on his last day he was working the front counter register. This lady walks up to order and he just stares at her. After a few seconds she says, can you take my order?" In his very calm and polite voice he says, "Oh, I am sorry, ma'am, but I cannot." There was another awkward pause and she says, well, why not?" He responds with, "Because I am a dinosaur." He immediately started growling and roaring at her, and he walked back and forth behind the counter like a T-Rex. He did this until the GM, who was back making food, realized what was going on. On her way up to the counter, he calmly clocked out and left. The GM had to apologize over and over again to the poor woman trying to order. That kid was a Taco Bell legend for several years. Edit. I forgot to add that he was a 6'3", 250 lb-ish burly guy who wore eyeliner and had blue hair. I wasn't there to see it, but my coworkers have talked about the cabinet incident. Last year was my first year of teaching, and I was working in a low-income inner-city school. People kept saying to me, "There's no way you could possibly be worse than the last girl we had." When I asked what they meant, I was told that a few years prior the principal had hired a first-year teacher. Apparently one day she got so overwhelmed and upset by the behavior of her class that she chucked a ream of paper out the window and then ran into the back room, shut herself in a big cabinet and cried. Her class was unsupervised for a while. Apparently none of the kids had told anyone what happened. And when the principal found her, she was curled up on the floor of the cabinet, rocking back and forth and sobbing. Clearly she was fired soon after that. I didn't stay at that school longer than a year because the principal was the equivalent of Satan. But when I left, she said to me, "Despite all the shit you were put through this year from your kids, you're the first teacher I can remember who I never saw cry at school." I'll take that as a compliment, I suppose. Working a retail summer job. A forklift driver was moving a skid of pickled eggs that wasn't wrapped properly. It fell, and a shittin' of juice and eggs went everywhere. Manger comes out and does the takes-off hat and throws it on the ground while yelling, "Go down it!" After he went full Gunnery Sergeant Hartman on the dude's ass for fucking up, it was enough to make him cry and quit the next day. Edit. Some follow-up. Mr. Manager was with HR the next day, lost his manager position for a few months. When he got his manager position back, he was pretty chill from now on. Some of us younger guys don't like it as much because his outbursts were quite funny. I remember one time I was getting an earful and I could hear some of my friends trying to contain their laughter in the next aisle. As for the forklift guy, he did come back and is now working mornings instead of evenings. First, this involves the new 5-pound notes. For those who don't know, they're polymer notes, and if you fold them up, they tend to stay folded. It's important for the story. I served a customer, a friendly old man with white hair, who paid with a folded £5. I put it in the till. A few minutes later, my boss was in the till and saw the folded note. He decided that the folds meant it had been rolled up into a tube to snort coke with. He was absolutely adamant. I said no, I just took that note from an old man. He started yelling, rolling the note up in his fingers to make a tube, shouting at me, "Look, it rolls up like this! Don't tell me I don't know what I'm talking about! Don't tell me I'm wrong! He kept shouting at me, basically waiting for me to apologize and back down, say I was wrong. But I wasn't, so I didn't. He wound up storming off, throwing things and slamming things. He's fucking insane, and I should have complained, but there would be no point. Everyone knows what he's like and no one cares. I'm in radio, and one of the group of stations I worked at had an oldies station, a rock station, and a pop station in the same building. We had an announcer who was really eager and wanted to learn and work and was really a great guy. But the big bosses were total jerks to him and were stuck in their old ways of doing things. They treated the announcer, we'll call him Howard, really poorly, and Howard used to come in and vent about it. He ended up getting hired at another station, but before he left, he went into the music libraries and replaced all the Led Zeppelin songs on the rock station with a gospel song from the oldies station called Trumpets of Jesus. For an entire weekend, anytime Led Zeppelin was supposed to play, Trumpets of Jesus played instead. Howard has since gone on to become program director and has won all kinds of leadership awards. Total legend. Edit. For those asking where it was at a station in Canada. I used to work in a kitchen in an old folks' home. I had a manager named Edward who was a know-it-all piece of uninformed shit. I had a co-worker named E who had a very serious medical condition and required a certain medication at certain points of the day. Edward didn't like E or the fact that she needed to keep her medication on her person. One day E forgot her medication and begged to run home and retrieve it. Edward smugly denied her and told her to finish work. So she tried and ended up briefly collapsing. She was okay, but very weak and disoriented. Edward grabbed her by her arm, escorted her to her car, handed her the keys, and told her to leave. Then he left. To go tell anyone that would listen that E was on drugs and he smelled booze on her. E was in the parking lot and called her mom to take her to the hospital. E was only 20 and very scared. E was discharged that night after some fluids and came back the next day upon hearing what Edward told everyone about her. She stormed into HR screaming for them to bring Edward's ass in the office immediately. As soon as he was called in, she whipped her name tag at him. I obviously lingered close by like a nosy bitch. She was screaming at the top of her lungs that Edward denied her to go home to get her medication. That was on file and HR was very aware of, and how fucking dare he accuse her of being a drug addict. And if he really believed she was under the influence of something, how stupid was he to put her in a car on the company's property, leaving them liable for her damages? At this point, much noise can be heard, as all three of them are screaming full force at one another. She threatened legal action and stormed out. Well, she did take legal action, for a ton of shit, including putting a clearly ill person behind the wheel. Not too long after this, I also quit. And a few months later, Edward was no longer employed by the kitchen, but rather was working as a deli boy in the local grocery store. I don't know what happened with S' lawsuit, but I hope that place and Edward got everything they deserved. Also, honorable mention to R, the maintenance man that threatened to shoot my old boss in the face for being such a dickless weasel. In high school, I worked at a grocery store, and this kid was all pissed off at another bagger and swearing in front of the customers. He said he was hoping he'd get fired. I told him he should quit before he gets fired so that it would look better on his resume in the future. A few minutes later, I realized he was missing. Then suddenly he comes around the corner from the manager's office, no longer in uniform. He threw his uniform in the trash in front of the manager. Then he looked at me and said loudly, "I took your advice," then proceeded to walk across the front end, point to each associate saying "fuck you" to each of them, and walked out. Everyone was staring at me after, and I said, "I did not tell him to do that." Thanks for watching. Make sure to leave your stories in the comments section. I'd love to make a video about them in the future. Make sure to like and subscribe too.